First of all, I'd like to thank you all for your patience. We had to postpone the event by nearly just over 2 months, I think now. And we know that that might have caused some of you a bit of disruption. So thank you for hanging on in there. It's really good to see you today. Especially massive thanks to everybody who's volunteered to either run or support the session, whether it's a breakout or a workshop, or facilitating, helping to plan and organize. This entire event would literally not exist were it not for everybody's participation. So thank you so much. I wanted to give a few shout outs, especially this year, to some people who've gone the extra mile. So a huge shout out to Namami, who will be running a session at 10:15 p.m. Japan time, and to Pamela, who's dialing in from Washington, DC to run a session at 6:45 a.m. I don't know if these people are here or not. If it was me, I'd be in bed still. And finally to Susanna and Tasha, who will be dialing in from Minneapolis to run a session at 5:45 a.m. And I think we've already had somebody dial in from somewhere in Canada, and it was about 4:40 a.m. So it's really good to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time, whether it's early or late, to come join us. We really appreciate it. This is the order of the day today. We've got a similar lineup tomorrow with a few important changes, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. So we've expanded the format from last year. Last year was the first time we ran this event, and last year was a one-day event. So we've doubled the number of days, and we've more or less tripled the number of attendees who could come. It sold out really quickly last year. And we've also this year opened things up to people outside of the civil service, because we wanted to make this as broad a thing as possible. The theme of the event this year is inclusivity by design. And so most of the sessions that you attend and participate in will touch on that theme in some way. We're going to kick off shortly with a keynote from Amy Hugh, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. Then there'll be a short break, and then we'll launch into an hour of breakout sessions at 11:30. And I'll explain in a minute how you can pitch ideas for sessions. We've got a couple of sessions already planned, but there's plenty of space for more. And then we're going to have some lunch. And then after lunch, there's an optional energy activity energizer to get you back into a participatory mood. And then after that, we've got 90 minutes of time for workshops. And the workshops all run in parallel, but the people who are running them, nearly all of them have very kindly volunteered to run them across both days. So you'll be able to attend one tomorrow if you didn't get a chance to attend today. And then at 3:45, we'll wrap things up with a few closing remarks from Tom Reed, who's the CEO of GDS. And throughout the day, people will be sharing their hard-won experience of maintaining, sustaining, measuring and justifying design systems. And they'll also be digging deeper into patterns for specific things, so things like photo capture, multilingual chatbots, iconography, and conversation design. Those are just some of the things that people are going to be talking about today. As well as being a fun and interesting 2 days, we hope that the event is also a celebration of the power of a vibrant, engaged community like this one. The whole event is free and it's community driven, like I say, 100% community driven, and it wouldn't be possible without people volunteering their time to run breakouts and workshops and facilitate and so on. So again, a huge thanks to all of you. We have shared the code of conduct for the 2 days with you in the joining instructions, I think, and we're going to post them at fairly regular intervals in the chats. The actual code of conduct is much more detailed than this slide, but I think this slide pretty much summarizes it. No surprises really, so please be present and respectful. Try to participate as much as you're able to. Respect people's style of communication, respect their time. Please be constructive rather than critical. Be open to diverse perspectives. Like I say, we've got a very broad range of people with a broad range of backgrounds and contexts. So don't assume that everybody has the same context as you. And of course, please be mindful of confidentiality. So if somebody asks not to share something, please don't share it. And if you want to take screen grabs, please be mindful of what you do with them. Please don't video anything unless you've got consent beforehand and so on. But like I say, we'll be sharing a link to the code of conduct in the chat. If you have any concerns, please do get straight in touch with one of the organizers. We're the people with the word organizer in our title, and the backgrounds of our screens will look like this slide here, and we'll deal with it immediately. So breakout pitching, this is the thing that's happening at 11:45. But like I say, please pitch ideas, any ideas for sessions between now and then. We're going to share a link to a Padlet in the chat where you can give a brief summary of your idea for a session. They can be up to 45 minutes and any format. And really what we're trying to create with these breakout sessions is an opportunity for you to just chat to people about a particular theme or topic. If you've ever done like lean coffee, that's the kind of thing we're aiming for. So they definitely don't have to be planned. There doesn't need to be a slide deck or a kind of a particular format or so on. It's really just, like I say, a chance to meet your fellow attendees and chat about specific things. So if you'd like to run a session, if you've got an idea, please pitch them, like I say, between now and 11:30. There should be a link to a Padlet in the chat now where you can go and do that. Okay, I'll move on to the first item of the day, which is our keynote speaker. So we're very, very happy to have Amy Hube here to talk to us. Amy is a UK-based design systems and content design consultant, and she'll be talking today about building conscious design systems. Over the last few years, Amy's worked on design systems for Springer Nature, BT, and Babylon Health. But before that, Amy spent 3 years working as a senior content designer here at GDS, specifically alongside myself and our colleagues on the design system team. During that time, she led the content strategy for the GovUK design system, including the design of a straightforward and inclusive approach to documentation. And I think it's fair to say that Amy's involvement in the early days of the GovUK design system was crucial to its success. And the quality of the guidance in the design system is something that is often remarked upon. So thank you, Amy, for giving us an amazing start a couple of years ago and for setting such a high standard for us to strive and maintain. Before I hand over, just a heads up, we're going to use Zoom's built-in Q&A feature. So you should see the little Q&A icon at the bottom at the top of the screen. Please do add questions there as and when they occur to you. And at the end of the presentation, we'll spend about 15 minutes going through them and chatting about them and so on. But without further ado, if everybody's ready, I'm going to hand over to Amy now. So I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Hello, yes, let me start screen sharing. Thank you, Tim. That's probably the nicest thing you've ever said about me. Glad it was recorded. Okay, let me share this. Tell me when you can see my screen. Is that all looking good? Okay, all great. Good. Cool. Okay, let's get cracking then. So, yeah. It's so nice to be here. It really means a lot to me, actually, like having kind of worked at GDS and kind of started my design systems career there. It's really lovely to be here and to be able to kind of talk to you about this today. So for those of you who are just thinking, who on earth is this person? As Tim said, so I'm Amy and I am a consultant. I work in the UK and I specialise in two main areas. So the first one is content design and the second one is design systems, and for obvious reasons that's the one I'm going to concentrate on today. I'm just repeating what Tim said at this point, but there is some original content in here, I promise. So just to kind of recap, I've worked on design systems for gov.uk. I started off there, worked there 3 years, and then I went to work at Babylon Health as a consultant. I've worked at BT, which includes also EE and PlusNet. And I'm currently working with Springer Nature. And in those places, I've worked as both content designer, focusing on the documentation and the sort of content side of design systems. And I've also worked as a kind of design systems manager, which is what I'm doing right now. So today I'm going to start talking about how design systems can perpetuate systemic bias. So nice light talk just to get the proceedings going. And to illustrate kind of how this happens, I thought I would start by just getting us to think about one of the ways that bias can get perpetuated in our society in general, away from this kind of space of design systems and the web and whatnot, but actually kind of out in the real non-digital world. So I'm going to start by talking about this example, which I expect probably a few of you have seen before. It's this idea that children's clothing design can embody and reinforce harmful gender stereotypes. So just in case you haven't seen it, I'm going to walk us through it. So this is a pattern that we often see, and there's been lots of articles and sort of Twitter threads and things about this. And it's this idea that girls' clothing will often have slogans on it like positive energy only, while boys' t-shirts, on the other hand, will say things like never hold back. And on the one hand, you know, there we've got girls being told only bring your positive side to the table, whilst boys are being invited to bring whatever they want to. And in the same vein, we've got things like shine every day for girls, certainly something I try to do. And for boys, we've got be fearless. And in the festive department of Amazon, which is a very depressing place, I spent about 30 minutes on collecting these examples the other day, we've got friends and magic for girls. And for boys, dear Santa, I can explain. So the message is clear here. We're telling boys to be bold and be fearless and let it all out, and to revel in being rebellious and pushing at boundaries. And at the same time, we're telling girls to be friendly and be polite and keep people happy and just be nice. And you might be thinking, God, are we not just overthinking this? Are we honestly saying that something as innocuous as the words on a t-shirt of a small child can contribute to gender stereotypes that follow people into their adult lives? Isn't this just a bit much? No. So as a woman, I can tell you that this kind of message is insidious. It really does get into you. So I feel this expectation for me to be nice and to keep people happy. And, you know, I've been told to do that in subtle and not so subtle ways all my life. And that does make it hard sometimes to come and give talks like this, where maybe I'm being a little bit kind of challenging and trying to force people to confront difficult truths about the work that they're doing and the we're doing. So, you know, I do feel that. But in my case, fortunately for me in some ways, there is this other layer to this. So one interesting thing about me is that my parents actually separated when I was 18 months old, and I ended up staying with my dad. So this is me and my dad when I was about 7, sitting on some classic 90s bamboo floral furniture, which I'm sure some of you remember, which I'm sure probably should have been in a conservatory, but for some reason was just in a house. And so, yeah, I spent the majority of my early childhood living with my dad and therefore being dressed by my dad. And my dad had a slightly less conventional approach to dressing me. So here's me in a t-shirt my dad bought me age 7, I want you to keep that in mind. And you can't see it that clearly in this photo, but it's a picture of Lister from Red Dwarf, which was a programme that was kind of big in the, I want to say 90s and early noughties. And I absolutely loved it back then. I'm sure some of you probably remember it. And on the t-shirt, Lister's holding some kind of space weapon I don't really remember the name of. And it says on the t-shirt in large and frankly unavoidable lettering, let's get out there and twat it. So thanks, Dad, for that. Not sure why he thought this was appropriate for a small child, but that's the energy I'm going to try and bring to this talk today. So I will speak my mind and talk about building conscious design systems with that sort of attitude. So the very first thing to address is, what is a conscious design system? Now, when I ran through this talk with a few people before I gave it here today, one of the pieces of feedback I got is that the right word? What do you mean by that? Which is a fair piece of feedback. To be honest, I probably could have picked a better word, but this just fit nice and neatly on my slide, so I'm sticking with it. But to be really clear from the outset, when I say conscious in this context, I do not mean conscious as in, is this AI sentient? And I also don't mean conscious as in one of the 9 levels of consciousness in traditional Buddhism. And nor do I mean it in the way that a CTO at a startup that I once worked for used to always say that he was just conscious of time, 5 minutes to the hour in every meeting where he had done most of the talking. So when I say conscious today, when I talk about building conscious design systems, I'm really talking about just becoming more aware of how our biases and our assumptions feed into them. So let's look at that. Now, when we talk about the benefits of design systems, we tend to talk about 3 kind of common promises, which are efficiency, So a design system will reduce waste in your design and development processes, and it will help you go faster. We talk about consistency. A design system will help you to standardize your digital experiences. And we talk about scale. So a design system will help you to scale your design decisions across your digital landscape. But here's the thing that we rarely ever say. None of this is actually inherently valuable. If you heard a noise just then, that was the sound of me being ousted from the world of design systems consultancy. And you might well be thinking, well, what's the point then? But the important bit for me is this word inherent. So it doesn't have any inherent value. And it doesn't mean that these things can't be massively beneficial depending on what we do with them. But it's worth being clear that efficiency is only valuable if it helps us to move faster towards meaningful outcomes for the people who are using our products and services. And consistency is only valuable if we standardize things to a good level of quality. So there's nothing good about consistently crap. Radical, right? And scaling things is only valuable if they're things that are actually worth reproducing. And although this might all sound kind of obvious, I say it because I've noticed a shift recently in the conversation around design systems that is starting to concern me. So it feels to me as though a lot of these conversations have become so fixated and so focused on the mechanisms of our design systems, so the artifacts that make it possible for us to deliver on those promises of efficiency and consistency and scale, that we've kind of lost sight of why we're doing this work in the first place, which is, I think, to help create better outcomes and experiences for the people using our products and our services. And when I push on this point with people, a common response that I get is that, design system teams are just there to enable teams creating the product experience, but they themselves can't be held accountable to it because they're not working on it directly. And although this quote is just a representation of that response and it isn't from a real person, you can trust me when I say that this is based on a true and pervasive story. And although I do agree that design systems, of course, can't be solely responsible for the resulting user experiences and outcomes, I also don't think they can draw such a hard boundary and have such a separation from that. Because if we agree that actually there's no inherent value in the added capability promised by design systems, so that efficiency, consistency, and scale that we talk about, then the value must lie instead in what we do with it. But you see, this introduces a problem, because if we can use our design systems to speed up meaningful work and standardize things to a high quality and scale things that we do actually want to reproduce, then the reverse is also true. It means that we can use our design systems to speed up problematic work and standardize things to a poor quality and scale things that we don't actually want to reproduce. So in other words, not only is this work that we're doing not inherently valuable, but it's also not inherently harmless. And that's something I don't think we can ignore. So to understand how design systems present a risk, let's have a look at how they work at just the most basic level. So we create design systems by curating and distributing a collection of components, patterns, and content. And then as product teams start to use the design system to build websites and applications, these things start to get scaled across our digital landscape and maybe even beyond as they start to influence the way that we design for other channels and maybe even the services that we offer. But it's important to say again that the mechanisms that our design systems use to scale have no inherent value unless they are things that we actually want to scale. And so what happens when that's not the case? So to look at that, we can look at a couple of examples of what happens when the risk of design systems is not managed. So let's start by looking at a common component. This component is called a drop-down or a select, and it's normally used to help people select an option from a list. And this is quite prevalent. So I imagine probably all of us have seen or used one of these on the web or on our phones at some point. And even though it's kind of pretty prevalent, the accessibility issues with it are actually quite well documented. So way back in 2014, Alice Bartlett, who is a front-end developer who's working at the Government Digital Service at the time, gave a whole talk describing the problems that she'd seen when people were trying to use drop-downs. So again and again, she saw things like people being unable to close the drop-down or trying to type into it, or getting confused between focused options and selected ones, or trying to pinch zoom the options on touchscreen devices without success. And the thing is that actually most of the time, a lot of the time at least, these issues are completely avoidable, because in many cases, we actually don't really need to use a drop-down, and we could just as easily let our users answer using a different and less problematic component. So, for example, for drop-downs with a reasonably kind of short set of options, it makes much more sense for us to use radio buttons to let users pick an option, which don't come with this same kind of suite of accessibility issues. If you don't know exactly what options your users might need to enter, then a free text field might be a better alternative for users. And it also helps us as the person kind of rendering that to gather information about the range of responses that we might get. And if you do know the range of answers that you're going to get, and that range is large, then using an autocomplete can help users to find what they're looking for. And I should say that none of this means that we should never use drop-downs, because there are absolutely times when a drop-down is genuinely the best or indeed the only option that we have. But they probably shouldn't be the first thing that we turn to. And that's where I think design systems and their documentation need to do some of the heavy lifting here and some of the kind of risk management. So a good design system should give context. It helps users to make informed choices about when and when not to use components, because there is a big difference between a design system that just says, here's a drop down, knock yourself out, and one that consciously lays out the problems that it carries and describes the common alternatives, and ultimately helps designers and developers to decide when the trade-offs that are there are ones that are worth making. So let's move on from drop-downs now and think about a design pattern. Let's think about how we ask users for their name. Now, this is something that most design systems include, but when I think about how a lack of diversity in the kind of tech industry as a whole shows up in our work, this is actually one of the first things that I think about. And that's because a lot of us who are working in this space have some really narrow and biased ideas about names and what constitutes a real name. So this is a list of 40 false beliefs about names put together by Patrick McKenzie, and it's well worth a read if you haven't seen it before. I'm not going to read through it now because I'll be here all day, but the important point is the kind of breadth of these misconceptions that we have. And the problem is that when these false assumptions inform our design systems, kind of consciously or unconsciously, and our patterns for asking people for names, we start to exclude people. So here's an example by Stephanie Walter, whose name includes an accent over the first E. And the validation here has been set in such a way that it's literally not possible for her to enter the correct rendering of her name. And this example comes from Pandu Supriyono. So it's common for Indonesians to have a single name, which means that there's no first name, last name distinction on his passport. But when he registered with the Dutch Corona Checker app during the coronavirus pandemic, it's recorded his name here as Null. And here's another example from Mikhail Echevarri, whose name was registered as invalid in this form. And this particular example is something you see all the time. There are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of this happening all over the internet. There's actually a whole Twitter account called something like, I should have written this down, your name is not valid, I think. I'll share it afterwards. But the really interesting thing for me was that when I was scrolling through and collecting these examples from Twitter for this talk, I noticed this kind of common comment that kept coming up over and over again from people when they shared these screenshots, which is, this is the story of my life. So a lot of those people are saying that flippantly, right? But the thing is that when this happens to people over and over and over again, we're giving them a really clear message. This is not for you. So we become authors in that story of exclusion. And I've only talked about names here, but in reality, our design systems cover much more than just names. And when we don't design for this full human spectrum of identities and characteristics and circumstances and experiences that our design systems need to serve, we're not just excluding people. Sorry, Siri's talking to me. We're not just excluding people, we are erasing them. And that's bad, right? This is why I think it's so important that we start to approach the work of design systems with more consciousness, because even though sometimes our design systems might seem like harmless scaling machines, we've got to start thinking about what happens if those components that we've built are inaccessible, or if the patterns that we've designed are discriminatory, or if the content within our design system that we've written and we've asked for people to use in their products is exclusionary. Because what happens in these situations is that we create a system of harm. We actually industrialize discrimination, and we set up a production line which allows us to ship exclusion to the people using our products quickly, consistently, and at scale. And I do want to clarify again at this point that, yes, I know that design systems alone are not responsible for all these problems. So a lot of the work here has to be done at the level of individual kind of products and services. And also, you know, it's worth saying design systems form part of our wider digital, political and social systems. They don't just transcend them. So it's those systems in their entirety that kind of foster the sort of harm that I'm talking about here. But design systems, I think, certainly can contribute to and perpetuate these problems. And I also think that they can help to reduce and counteract them. What we absolutely can do, the thing that is within our power, is to recognise and mitigate risks and to work to build conscious design systems that do sort of challenge some of these problems. So let's talk about how we do that. How do we create conscious design systems? Well, there's a lot of debate about whether design systems should set out what good looks like, or if they should simply systematize existing practices. And for the record, for what it's worth, I fall into that first camp there. So I think design systems should strive to set out kind of what good looks like. But whichever camp you fall into, whatever you think, at the very least, we should distinguish between these two things because they aren't the same. So it's really important that those of us working on design systems and contributing to them have this ability to question what we consider to be default solutions and recognize that common practice doesn't mean good practice. So returning to the drop-down example that I shared earlier, we can clearly see how incredibly prevalent these have become in our digital services, despite known issues with them. And I can't help but think that a big reason for this is just, well, everyone else is doing it, so must be fine. When we see a digital practice forming, it's really easy to assume that we've converged on something sensible, but that's not always the case. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the bandwagon effect. If something gains enough kind of critical momentum, it's easy for it to scale, even if it's not a good thing. And relatedly, I do also want to highlight that just because Google does it doesn't mean it's good. So a case in point here. Until 2017, these were the text fields for Material UI, which is Google's open source design system. So Google's design in Material UI at that time replaced traditional text input boxes for users to type into with lines for users to type onto. And this unconventional approach raised concerns with some designers and accessibility experts who suspected that the affordance of the line would maybe cause confusion for some people and could impact usability. But this was Google, right? So a lot of people who had those concerns just found themselves shouting into the void. And one of those people was my colleague at Springer Nature, Hayden Pickering, who wrote about this in his article, which he named "Listen to Me and Not Google." Yeah, it's my dream to write an article titled that bold one day, but not today. Anyway, Hayden was saying that when a client that he was working with wanted to follow Google's design, he told them, these don't look like input fields, and they're probably not going to be identified as input fields. In fact, they actually look like horizontal rules. So I advise that you adopt a more conventional input design, wherein the field takes the form of an empty box into which the input is supplied. And in this article, Hayden explains that even though the client was respectful to him, they kind of hit a sticking point here on the basis that this was coming from Google. So understandably, the client felt that this kind of legitimized the pattern. So, don't underestimate authority bias. But then in 2017, Google discovered for itself Google announced that it was redesigning its text field. So they conducted some usability testing on the original design and discovered for themselves these issues that others had raised. So they learned that actually the line affordance under the old text fields was not clear to some users, and it was confused with the divider. And although the author of the article that I just pointed to didn't discuss the rationale for the original design in the article itself, one reader took to the comments to probe about this. So they asked, was there research conducted on the original inputs that validated that they met a goal that wasn't being met by traditional box inputs? And in the interest of time, I'm not going to give Google's full response here, but just to paraphrase, they said, no. Now, I don't want to go too hard on Google here, but I will say that with great power comes great responsibility. So Material UI may have updated its text fields now, but thousands of other organizations had already adopted its first design and haven't since followed suit on the change. So you'll still see a lot of those line inputs across the web. People just assumed that Google would have done its research in the first place and that its patterns could be counted on. And that's why it's so important that we do question our defaults, because prevalence is not an indicator of quality, it's just an indicator of prevalence. Just because an approach is common, it doesn't mean it's inclusive. And that brings me on to my next recommendation for creating a conscious design system, which is to prioritize inclusion at every level. So a theme across the examples that I talked about today is exclusion. And as I hope I've shown, when we create design systems without a conscious intention to mitigate harm, and also a strategy to help us fulfill that intent, we end up excluding people by default. And the best way for us to mitigate this, to avoid exclusion, is to prioritize inclusion. So to focus on the thing that we want. And inclusion doesn't start and finish with the experience of the people using our products or using our design systems. The question of inclusion begins at the level of the design system team. From there, it expands out through its contributors, through the teams who use it, through the wider organization that it sits within, and eventually to the community of people who use the products that it gets used to create. And it's important for us to think about inclusion at all of these levels to understand whether the experiences that we're helping to create are inclusive or not. So perhaps the very first place for us to start this conversation is with the team who manages and creates and maintains a design system. And just a really quick test might be, does that team look like this? Now, it's important to say that diversity isn't inclusivity. Diversity is just variety. And if we aim to recruit a diverse team without really thinking about inclusivity, that's a recipe for disaster. But if we don't have, or we can't sustain a diverse team, a team that doesn't look like this, then it's probably a good indicator that our team is not very inclusive. So why does this matter? How is it that those of us creating design systems can impact people who are all those layers away using the products and services that design systems get used to build? Well, it all comes down to the knowledge and experiences that get fed into our design systems. So Kim Creighton, who is an anti-racist economist, talks about two different types of knowledge. The first kind is explicit knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that is easy for us to articulate and codify and store, and it can be easily transferred from one person to another. And the second type of knowledge is tacit knowledge, which is more complicated. Tacit knowledge is developed through a person's lived experience, and it's much harder to transfer tacit knowledge from one person to another by just writing it down or verbalizing it. And it's actually this second kind of knowledge, this tacit knowledge, that allows us to really propagate inclusivity through our design systems. Because if we're not building our design system in an inclusive environment that supports participation from a diverse set of perspectives, then we can't design inclusive experiences. And if we haven't experienced exclusion ourselves, then it can be really hard to mitigate it because we're much less likely to spot it until it's too late. Now, I'm not a diversity and equity and inclusion expert, and I'm not going to pretend to be, but I really can see the impact here. I can see this kind of pattern and this correlation between the attention that gets paid to inclusion in teams and organizations and the eventual kind of inclusivity of the experiences that they create. And we do have to be able to see this happening if we're going to fix it. Because having visibility over the impact of our design systems is critical, it's non-negotiable if we want to maintain awareness and create strategies to support our intentions. And this brings me on to my next recommendation, which is to create conscious design systems, we have to understand the impact and respond accordingly. And that means having strong feedback loops into our systems. So one important way we can do this is to invite contribution from the teams who are using our design systems to create products and services. Now, this isn't a new thing. A lot's been said about contribution. I know I've said a lot about contribution, so I'm not going to get into it in too much detail here, but I'm very happy to point you to some further information on how to establish a contribution practice afterwards, if that would be helpful. But for now, I'm just going to share 3 of the most important things that I've learned about supporting contribution. So the first thing is that creating strong feedback loops means working to make it as easy as possible for people to share their insights. And that calls for a flexible approach. So we can think about creating a diverse set of feedback mechanisms that allow different groups of people to contribute. I think quite often we can default to sort of optimizing a developer contribution experience by just saying, go to GitHub, contribute there. And that might work for developers. They might be more comfortable doing that. But for people from other disciplines like designers and content designers and user researchers, they might prefer to send an email or submit feedback through Slack or an inline form in a design system documentation website. And it's really important that we do make space for all of those different routes into our design system if we want to make sure we're hearing from a diverse group of people. Using templates also helps contributors to understand what information they should provide and makes insights easier for the design system team to digest and compare. So this could be something like an issue template in GitHub with basic headings setting out the information that you're looking for. Or if you're using a form of some kind to collect feedback, then you can perhaps design the fields to reflect the information that you want. And lastly, and probably most importantly, it's really important to be proactive about gathering feedback. So we can't just sit there and wait for people to contact us. We need to go out and observe how our design systems are working in the wild. So we can ask teams if we can go and observe their research or set up our own research to test components and patterns with people in the group that might end up using them. The bottom line is, as I've discovered the hard and painful way, when it comes to contribution, this work is hard to the point of being almost impossible to get right. And we absolutely must do it anyway, because it is these insights that help us to really understand how our systems are working in practice. And this is critical. We can't build inclusive design systems without truly understanding their impact. But this also presents us with a problem. So hopefully we can agree that it wouldn't be practical to try and create our design systems in such a way that they're 100% inclusive for every single person and every single scenario in which they might access something from it. Human beings are really complicated and there are too many variables for us to consider. So we've got to think about a more practical option. And this brings me on to my last recommendation, which is to center stress cases. If we can't create design systems with every single person in mind, then what we can do instead is to prioritize the people who are most at risk of harm if we don't take them into consideration. Or to put it another way, we should prioritize stress cases. Now, the term stress cases was coined by Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher in their book Design for Real Life, which I really, really recommend if you haven't read it. It's had a massive impact in the way that I approach this work. And in the book, they say real life is complicated. We might experience harassment or abuse, we might lose a loved one, we might become chronically ill, we might get into an accident, have a financial emergency, or simply be vulnerable for not fitting into society's expectations of us. Historically, our industry has called these edge cases because they only affect a small number of users in theory. And Sarah and Eric propose redefining these situations not as edge cases, but as stress cases. So the moments that put our design and content choices to the test of real life. So instead of treating stressful situations like fringe concerns, what we can do instead is move them to the center and start with the most vulnerable people and then work our way outwards. And I do want to stop here and acknowledge that you might be listening to me now and thinking, this all sounds a bit beyond the scope of a design system team. Can't we just focus on shipping components and let product teams handle inclusion? You're probably not thinking that because you're all really nice people, but it might have crossed your mind. But no, we can't do that. Becoming conscious of how our design systems perpetuate harm isn't a distraction from the work. It actually is the work. And if I can leave you with one thought today, it's this. Building a conscious design system is going to slow you down. There are no silver bullets here because part of building a conscious design system is reducing our speed to understand our impact. So nothing that I've shared today is a quick fix, but it's more a direction of travel. And I think it's really important, and I'm asking you to support me in this, that we balance the conversation around design systems and we spend at least as much time talking about human impact as we do about the mechanisms of our design systems and those artifacts that comprise them. So those mechanisms that our design systems use will change because technology is going to change and our environment will change and our requirements will change and our expectations are going to change. But concentrating on human impact provides us with a consistent focus and a point of continuity, and that will help us to weather this change and to adapt our systems accordingly. And in the end, it is the only thing that really matters, right? So we can't know exactly what challenges lie in front of us in the world of design systems. And we certainly can't know what challenges lie ahead in the wider world, but we can choose what we decide to center. We can choose to create conscious design systems that put people at their heart, even if that slows us down. We can choose to do it anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. This tendency of any kind of system to either do good or harm is a subject really close to my heart, and I imagine it is for a lot of other people here as well. I've been looking at the chat, and there are so many resonant examples of ways in which patterns can be used at scale and can have been developed thoughtlessly and unthinkingly, and therefore propagating, like you say, propagating maybe small, maybe larger examples of harm, depending on how much privilege you've got, basically. Mm-hmm. Before I launch into the Q&A, and we've got at least 3 or 4 questions come through that I'll chat about in a minute, I just want to give a nudge for the breakout sessions. So they're happening in, I think, about half an hour. 25 minutes. If anything that you've heard just now or anything else has kind of triggered something in your mind and you'd like to chat to other people about this thing, this question, this topic, please do add to the Padlet that I think someone's going to post a link to. That's exactly what these breakout sessions are for. And it's we're trying to kind of simulate the between session networking that happens in physical conferences, give you a chance to group up and talk about things that you have in common, questions that you might want to share with people and so on. So yes, please do add to the Padlet if something occurs to you. I'm going to take a look at the Q&A now. We've had a couple of really good questions. So let's have a look. The first one is from Frankie Roberto. How can design system teams and designers gain the authority to get systems to be changed to be less exclusionary, for example, for things like names and gender?
Hiya, Frankie. I think it's really hard. I definitely, I think Frankie and I have tackled some of those challenges together. So I kind of know that can be really difficult. I guess it starts with kind of conversations. So I think it can get kind of heated quite quickly when you start to get into questions of exclusion and inclusion and stuff. And I think it can be kind of easy for us to get kind of pulled down this road of like, well, you're being really exclusionary and that's morally wrong, and I'm trying to do the morally right thing. But I think as much as possible, trying to keep those conversations on a sort of human to human level, really understanding what the concerns are, and kind of working through those concerns. I also think there's a lot to be said for really bringing kind of stakeholders and leadership along with you on the journey of research. So rather than kind of like going away, doing a bunch of user research, like summarizing it all and coming back with your recommendations and findings, and if there's ways to invite those leaders along to really, there's something so powerful about watching people trying to use your design systems. That's kind of been the most emotive aspect of this work for me, is the times I've actually gone out and watched people try and use things and not be able to use things and realize what a terrible person I am. But yeah, I think that, kind of like trying to open up that kind of journey to those people is powerful. And I think also a lot of the time there's maybe a false dichotomy. I think we can sometimes imagine that if we want to be inclusive, we've got to make compromises that we're not willing to make. But actually, when you start to build inclusivity into the foundations of a system, it's just there, it just kind of scales. And I think that this idea that we have to kind of make compromises to, I don't know, like return on investment or speed and things like that, I think it's not true. It's just a different way of approaching the work. Nice.
And yeah, I totally agree. I think an anecdotal rich evidence on its own can always be dismissed, and really good quant data on its own often doesn't quite stick in the mind, but the two in combination I think can be really powerful.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add one more thing, which is to be kind of fair and kind to ourselves in this work as well. Like, I've been in this situation before where I haven't been able to make it happen. I know from research what the most inclusive thing to do is, and I haven't been listened to on that, and that can be really hard. And I think it's just important to sometimes recognize there are limitations to our power as people working on design system teams, and all we can do is the most that we can with the power that we have where we sit. So I think it's it's definitely a long game. I think we've both experienced steps forwards and even steps backwards in this space, and kind of accept that will occasionally happen. Something that, when you were talking and I was looking in the chat, so many of the examples, there's like a whole category of exclusion which pertains to people's personal data and for things like protected characteristics, name, gender, nationality, and so on. And it occurred to me that a lot of the decisions that make those things exclusionary are baked into like the architecture of our digital services. They're often decisions that got made a long time ago by technical architects and database engineers and so on. And I wonder if maybe we need to do more to reach out to that group of people who I don't often think of as being associated with users of design systems. We think of designers and researchers and perhaps front-end developers and perhaps developers as well, but some of this stuff is really buried deep in the architecture of the service. So yeah, and indeed the architecture of the organization. Sometimes, like as I kind of touched on in the talk, I think the diversity of the organization has a huge effect on this stuff. So I think it's these are conversations that we definitely need to be having beyond just the immediate sort of pool of design system practitioners that immediately come to mind when we think about this work.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go on to another question. Let's have a look. Thinking about the Google text input example, which is a really good one. So if you're building, say, for example, an Android app, some kind of mobile native app, is creating an input that is better a worthwhile trade-off for being inconsistent with Android's established design language? So this idea of like when there's a tension between two competing benefits, if you like, consistency versus usability.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I don't think there's a neat answer to it. I do want to just share that I gave this talk at a small kind of indie web design conference a couple months ago, and I had to give it in front of someone who was sitting in the front row from Google, so that was fun. But yeah, that whole kind of like, do you cater to kind of native conventions or best web practice or whatever, is a real challenge, especially with kind of multi-platform design systems. And I don't roast it. I don't think there's a kind of a clean answer that I can give here, because I think it's probably quite context specific. Yeah. I would say that this is completely top of my head, but I imagine most people are fairly familiar with box inputs. And I think if you put those into native apps, probably no one's going to go, what's that? Whereas we know people do that with the line input. So I think in that case, my instinct would be stick to kind of convention more broadly rather than kind of application specific convention. But yeah. I don't know. I haven't tested it.
It's a really good point. I think maybe as well, we sometimes try and use our own lived experience of being very digitally savvy people who use apps all the time and assume that the consistency is quite important. Whereas depending on the context, like I say, depending on the thing that you're designing and who's going to be using it, they may be very inexperienced with using apps on their phones. They maybe mostly use 2 different apps. And so the consistency argument is maybe less powerful for some people than just being intrinsically more usable.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, that kind of point, because actually as people who are building this stuff, what I've come to learn is like we are the most capable and the least tolerant audience for this stuff. And it's so hard to know kind of what things are going to impact our users or not. We're actually, for those reasons, incredibly bad at making those judgments. And that's why research is so important, because we have to kind of lean on our users and what they're doing, I think, more than our own judgment a lot of the time. Caroline.
I'm just smiling at a comment from Caroline Jarrett.
Yeah, I knew this would bait Caroline. I might as well just put @Caroline in a bunch of my slides. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go back to the Q&A. There's a question here from Ollie Byford. What can we do as design system maintainers to be more transparent about the gaps in our own research on a component or pattern, or things that we're still not sure about? How do we balance that transparency while still giving people enough confidence to use our stuff?
Hi, Ollie, I miss you. So how do we balance? Yeah, I mean, I think I co-wrote an article with Caroline Jarrett, who I was just talking about in the chat, and Ignacio Oriana, who's used to work at GDS with me, and we wrote an article about sharing research and design systems, and it was kind of informed by all of our experiences working in this area, and a particular piece of research that Ignacio and I did on sharing research and design systems and what people need from that. And one of the things that came through really strongly from that research was that people just want honesty. So actually, like, sometimes I think we have this sense that we have to really kind of give everything to design system users on a plate. We really have to kind of over explain everything, but we can trust them. I think you can trust product teams to make good judgments for themselves. What we need to do is to give them the information to be able to make those kinds of decisions. And sometimes that information is, we don't have any information on this. So I don't think we erode trust by kind of not exposing those gaps. I don't think we erode trust by the fact that those gaps are there. I think sometimes we can erode trust by not being forthcoming about them. So I would say, call out the gaps in your system, call out the things that you don't know, and then that gives them something to play with. They can go into their research looking for those things that we might be concerned about and looking to kind of fill those gaps. So yeah, it's a tricky one, but I think that's kind of my instinct, is be honest if you don't know. Yeah,
so I think if it's done well, you can probably build more trust by acknowledging where you lack certainty, because then people will trust the other parts of the system more, because they know that you would have told them if there was like a lack of knowledge in that space. Yeah, exactly. I guess like one challenging aspect of it is like, if we know that our team is not a very diverse team, and I've said in this talk, and I've worked on plenty of not very diverse teams, so I'm not sitting here in a kind of ivory tower saying I'm doing things really perfectly. But I think if we know that, sometimes it can feel quite vulnerable and exposing to say, oh, we don't know if this is inclusive. But I just think we have to remind ourselves, like, documenting this stuff doesn't make any of it kind of more true. Like it is the case, and sometimes we have to own that. Thank you. there are two similar questions, so I'm going to read them both out, but they kind of lead on quite nicely from this. I think they're both on the theme of how can we make the actual contribution process itself more inclusive, which I know is a thing that you have thought a lot about. From Peter Marr, how do you diversify the decision-making input into what gets built in the design system? For example, not all about the coding of the component or not all about the visual aspect of it. And then a second question, which I think is related, is how can we make the GovUK design system team more inclusive in terms of the way that it invites feedback or alternative contributions?
Yeah, I have done a lot of kind of talking and writing about this, and somehow I still don't know the answer. I think, as I kind of said earlier to the first question that Frankie asked, it's really important that we recognise the limitations of our kind of power in the systems that we're working in. So I gave a talk on this a couple of months ago that maybe someone can find and share the link to, or I will afterwards, called Your Contribution Practice is Doomed. And the reason for that was that I think it's really important that we do recognise that actually in organisations that are kind of set up to either make profit or make savings, but ultimately some kind of financial gain, and are kind of quite product focused, and we have autonomous decentralized teams that are all working towards their own goals and KPIs, sorry, I'm miles away. I think it's really difficult to establish a contribution practice and to motivate people to contribute, because ultimately, like, people are incentivized to look at what's right in front of them. And actually getting them to kind of turn inwards and contribute to this centralized resource is difficult, and it's easier for some people than others to find the time and the motivation and the confidence to do that. So I think there's no kind of quick answer to this, but I think it's about just a consistent, sustained effort. This stuff doesn't happen automatically, and I think it's to not be passive about it. Like, just opening up design systems for contribution is going to let a very small number of people kind of contribute because they'll have the things that they need to be able to do so. Actually, it requires kind of active, sustained effort to go out there and kind of help people understand why it matters to contribute, and to harvest insights from people, and to find the people that you need to be talking to and learning from, and working out how to bring their insights and their kind of knowledge into the system. Yeah, I think, does that help?
Yeah, and I think your point that this stuff just tends to take quite a long time. I often think of like different parts of an organization moving at different speeds, like slow moving cogs and fast moving cogs and so on. And design systems feel like they're one of the slower moving parts of the whole kind of digital ecosystem in an organization. Yeah. Like, they need to be reliable and predictable to some extent.
Yeah, and they're not replacing nothing, right? Like, design systems are often coming in to just try to create some more efficiency in a system which is currently being created by individual kind of product teams that can move a bit faster. So we have to know that what we're providing people with is a better alternative than what they would do otherwise. Yeah. And that requires, I think, a slower pace and more consideration.
Maybe related to this is that because the pace can sometimes be slower, the job of selling and justifying the need to continue to maintain and sustain a system becomes quite important, because some of this stuff can only be realized over longer periods of time. I know Paul Smith is probably doing a talk later today on that subject, and tomorrow. But yeah, that's also something that we've often thought about. There's another question just come through, so I'm going to read it out from Elliot H. How would you weigh the value of inclusive design changes against other service/product features? This is especially relevant for those of us in public sector at the moment. I guess that's an allusion to purse strings, constraints, and so on.
It's really difficult. I don't want to kind of go like this, because I don't know. Like, this is a battle like I have to fight with the teams I work with all the time. I think that it's probably worth like having a kind of quite a frank conversation about what do you think that feature is going to achieve. So it's like, if we know that the experience that we're delivering is excluding some people, it's actually preventing them from being able to use our service, or it's creating barriers that mean that they're not able to kind of, that they're not motivated, and there's too much friction and they don't want to finish what they started, then we've really got to sort of talk about what do you think the value is of adding more onto this, like bolting more exclusionary stuff onto this kind of unwieldy and unsatisfactory system? What's that going to achieve? Because I think there is this kind of really frustrating, I think, association with delivering stuff, deliverables and success. And actually, as I think is a really strong part of the kind of the government and GDS sort of way of working, a lot of the time the best thing you can do is take things away and go back over old ground and clean things up and keep things simple. So but it's a kind of mindset shift, and I think it's about having those conversations with our leaders and really sort of coming back to what I said earlier, like supporting those claims with research and really showing what that looks like in practice, because I think otherwise it can just sound a little bit like, we want to go slower, we don't want to deliver as much. And it's about like delivering stuff and delivering value are not the same, or they're not always the same.
Absolutely. And like, I know that we've both experienced this on the teams that we've been on, where the team itself feels bad that it's not always be shipping components. The number of components and patterns is the key metric and so on. Very natural to foreground the thing that's easiest to count sometimes, rather than the thing that's most important or valuable.
Yeah.
And we have to remind ourselves about that.
Yeah. And I think that's like, again, this is something I've sort of spoken about a bit recently, but I think that there's this interesting thing that happens, and I've seen it happen on every single design system team I've worked with, where there's all this work goes into kind of getting the funding for a design system. And I think we almost shoot ourselves in the foot with the way that we get that funding, because we go, look at all this duplication of effort, look at all these people doing the same thing over and over again. It's so inefficient, it's wasting so much of our money. We must fix this, we must have a design system. And eventually we wear someone down and they go, have some money, have a team, go on then. And then the second that team is instated, it's like someone's creating a button over there and also someone's creating one over there, and we must stop that immediately because you told us this was really expensive and wasteful. And actually that's not how good sustainable design systems get created. You don't just flick a switch on and suddenly duplication of effort stops. We have to get comfortable with this idea that design systems are about reducing inefficiencies and increasing speed and scalability and stuff over time, but it's not this like sudden.
And maybe they have other purposes as well. They're a really useful tool for kind of educating and advocating and normalizing inclusive practices, a different kind of value, and one that you can't measure by pointing at the number of components you shipped this quarter.
I do. I think number of components is not a great metric. Like system coverage is an important thing to look at, of course, but it's actually, there are so many other important things that aren't to do with the number of components your design system has. And actually I'd say like bad components are probably worse than no components.
I'm just looking at the Q&A again. There's an anonymous question come through, which is a really good one. I haven't read much about components that are better than others. Where could I read about that, particularly around accessibility? I'm going to suggest that the person who posted that uses that as a breakout session question, because that feels like an ideal thing to get other people, other participants to kind of crowdsource answers to. I'm going to ask a question now that relates a little bit. You touched on the fact that you've now worked on maybe 4, maybe more big, but quite diverse design systems for very different types of organization: public sector, private sector, health, tech, telecommunications, research. And this might be a hard one to do in a safe way, but is there anything you can talk about the differences and the similarities that you've found in each of those organizations?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like the context is so different each time, and I sometimes get a little frustrated when I see people talking about like the right way to do design systems and being really dogmatic about the particular framework you should be using or the particular kind of model that you should be using for different aspects of your system, because it is like, I went into my first consultancy role with the very sort of clear directive from the client, like, that GDS contribution model, that looks great, can you just do that here? And actually, like, no, was the answer. It was a completely different scenario. The design language was still being established. There was big kind of silos between designers and developers. There was a real kind of like handover things being thrown over a wall and just kind of rehashed in very like fragmented front-end code bases. And it was also a multi-platform and multi-brand design system. So it just didn't work in that kind of same way. And we had to really take a very different approach. I think, yeah, like multi-brand design systems are a very different kind of beast. Multi-platform design systems are very different. That definitely introduces complexity. And I certainly think I've seen lots of organizations take inspiration from the way the GovUK design system is set up. And clearly I'm a big fan. But, you know, and I think championing that simplicity is great, is really important. But I think sometimes it can be easy to say, oh, look, you know, that they're using a really simple technology and all their documentation is really clear and simple and everything's lovely and kind of clean. But it's like, but they're dealing with like web only and one very clear brand. And so that's not, it's much harder in lots of other ways, as we know, working in government can be. But I think sometimes, I suppose what I'm saying is like, there are these variables that really, and they can be to do with culture, they can be to do with the architecture of the system, and they can be to do with the way that the things that the system needs to do, that really almost, you know, calling it a design system and meaning all these different things is a bit wild, because the actual implementation is so incredibly different.
So you really need to, before you launch into something, don't assume that your problem is the same as another organization's problem.
No, I think don't even assume that when you say design system, people mean the same thing by that. Actually, like really get explicit about what you mean when you say design system, and, you know, read all the articles and the blog posts and the thought pieces, because they're really helpful, and then kind of forget all of them and just do your research and find out what you need to do.
Brilliant. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up now because we're a few minutes away from the end. So once again, thank you so much. This has been a brilliant talk and a fascinating chat, and hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation and others in the breakouts and into the workshops as well today and tomorrow. Thanks again.
Thank you.